cell therapies are going to be the next thing that make a massive difference in the world. And it just goes back to me that a cell is a little machine. The sophisticated functions they're capable of is way beyond antibody or small molecule drug. And I think cell therapies are the only modality right now that have the potential that's analogous to what antibiotics did or what vaccines did, in the sense that these mechanisms were so great at what they do that they have virtually no toxicity, and yet they treated diseases that were killing us humans by the millions just 100 years ago. And I would say cell therapy is that next big leap, because now a cell is the only thing sophisticated enough to take out a tumor. Because the problem with tumors is they look too much like the rest of the stuff. It's really hard to be that specific.
Welcome back to the Smart Biotech Scientist Podcast. In part 2 of our conversation with Armon Sharei, founder and CEO of Portal Bio, we're taking a deep dive into enhanced drug screening and the fascinating world of cell delivery. If you're curious about how next-generation cell engineering could revolutionize drug development, you won't want to miss this. Let's jump right back in. Are you juggling the complexities of CMC development while trying to enjoy the beauty of biotech? Have you ever wondered if there's a way to simplify bioprocessing? Welcome to the Smart Biotech Scientist Podcast, where we're diving headfirst into the very challenges you face. We're breaking it down, demystifying the jargon, and giving you the keys to unlock your full potential. I'm your host, David Brühlmann, and I get it. With 15 plus years in the biotech industry, I face the same challenges you do. There's a way to simplify and streamline so you can remove complexity, you can skip trials and errors, deliver without delay your groundbreaking therapy to clinics at market, and still enjoy every single step. Do you want to learn how industry experts and I did it? Grab a cup of coffee and your favorite notebook and pen. Now is the time to take your bioprocessing game to the next level. Let's smarten up biotech. Just to go back to what you've said at the beginning, that everybody was excited about cell therapy, and now maybe we're going through a phase where we see some difficulties or some obstacles. Well, obviously, yeah, there has been a lot of hype and investment in cell therapies over the years, but do you think this was just a flash in the pan, or is there a real sustainable future, and a future also where we see a widespread adoption of cell therapies?
I definitely think cell therapies are going to be the next thing that make a massive difference in the world. And it just goes back to me that a cell is a little machine. The sophisticated functions they're capable of is way beyond antibody or small molecule drug. And I think cell therapies are the only modality right now that have the potential that's analogous to what antibiotics did or what vaccines did, in the sense that these mechanisms were so great at what they do that they have virtually no toxicity, and yet they treated diseases that were killing us humans by the millions just 100 years ago. And I would say cell therapy is that next big leap, because now a cell is the only thing sophisticated enough to take out a tumor. Because the problem with tumors is they look too much like the rest of the stuff. It's really hard to be that specific. Or autoimmune diseases, because it's a very complex cascade of dysfunctions. You need something that's much more complex in how it works in order to shut them down. And same with regenerative medicine. Like if you want a cartilage replacement or Parkinson's and you want to replace neurons, etc. So I think fundamentally cell therapy kind of has to be the future to me. I feel like that must be true. I think the challenge has been they're insanely difficult to engineer. And the first generation of cell therapies were trapped by that because viruses were the primary way in which people did anything. And viruses can only work for very specific cell types. They can only work for certain cargos. There's a lot of restrictions on what they can do. But if you release those restrictions, now you can program whatever you want into these cells. And you have to couple that with accessibility, because right now the mode of manufacturing cell therapies is extremely impractical, even for the rich world, where I have to take your cells, ship them to a central facility, do a week or two of manufacturing there, and then fly them back and inject you. The COGS are already over 100K. And even for the rich world, that's not very sustainable. But if you can simplify all this to be a dialysis-like machine that's at the bedside. So if you need to get a cell therapy, you just show up to the hospital, they put in a needle, and then for the next 2 hours, you're hanging out, I don't know, listening to this podcast while your cells get taken out, get engineered, and go back in. I think that's all very doable engineering-wise. You just need core technologies like what Portal does to help break through that current world.
And how specifically does your technology solve that bottleneck? Or like how it would change the development of cell therapies in the future?
So obviously I'm very biased, but I would think of it, let's take a typical cell therapy manufacturing right now and how different it can be. If you have a blood cancer and we're going to give you a CAR T treatment right now, we're going to have to send you to the hospital, take your blood, ship it to a central facility because it's very complicated to make their stuff on site. At the central facility, they're going to separate your white blood cells in like a big manual machine. They're going to put them on some activating factors. They're going to wait a day or two, and then they're going to add in a virus. And then they're going to wait again for a little bit. They're going to let your cells expand. Before you know it, depending on the process, 5 to 15 days later, they'll have your cell therapy. Now they need to freeze it, put it on a plane, ship it back to you, and then you go to the hospital and you get injected. So this is all insanely complicated. In a case like ours, you could just have a machine by your bedside, and some of our partners, like those at Fresenius Kabi, do these other components that we don't do, where, for example, your blood just goes through a microfluidic separator that pulls the white blood cells from the red blood cells. You don't need a big machine. You just use one of these separators. Then these cells in their kind of unactivated state can go through a portal membrane that's going to deliver to them an activation factor plus the CAR T that they're going to express. And then you're basically done. You clean up any undelivered material through another microfluidic wash and you can go straight back in. And the reason that's not possible today is because these viruses, they need the cells to be activated. So that's already 2 days being added to your process. And you need to be able to wash out and get rid of the virus and let the cells expand enough because you are limited in what cargo the virus puts in. So it gets into a lot of little problems that collectively make the current world the way it is, versus you could drastically simplify that with these systems.
Point of care production definitely makes a lot of sense. It would simplify a lot of things and hopefully also bring down the costs.
Yeah.
What else needs to happen so that in the future we will have more point of care production?
I think aside from kind of just the continued evolution of the engineering implementations that make this possible, which again, I think all those pieces already exist at this point. You just need to do it. I think you need more cell therapies that can address more diseases. Because right now, the cell therapies that exist are really only meant for last line blood cancers. It's not first line. Like if you just got diagnosed, you're definitely not getting a cell therapy. It's only if you failed the other stuff that you get it. So it's a very niche use case. It's hard to justify, even if it was point of care, it's hard to justify that much infrastructure for what is actually a relatively niche case for therapies. So this is where you need to expand the biology simultaneous to just making the engineering simple. It's a very intertwined problem. And on the biology side, this is where I think the big leap that people like us also help enable is most cell therapies right now rely on genetic modifications. So you are inserting a gene, you are deleting a gene, and that carries the risk that you screw something up. Now, in cancer, if you are about to die and this is your only alternative, no one cares. Because if we make you live another year, it doesn't matter if we give you a new cancer in 2 years. However, if you want to go to first-line oncology or autoimmune disease or regenerative medicine, all these other settings which are not as life-threatening, you can't really get away with that anymore. Because if you, for example, cured type 1 diabetes, but there is a 1% chance that child is going to get cancer from it, you're just not going to do it. You're like, insulin for the rest of their life, it is. And this is where the biology side comes in, because with systems like ours, it's really easy to deliver a lot of, let's say, siRNA, mRNA, circular RNA, all these other peptides and proteins, all these other molecular tools that can be used to program a cell without ever touching the genome. And if you can do that, you drastically reduce the risk profile. And by the way, there's a lot of mechanisms that are too powerful to turn on or off genetically because you will kill someone. But if you turn them on or off for a few days, that can be very powerful. Like a lot of the most powerful immune stimulatory domains or other things, you could never switch that gene on for life. So anyway, the point is by having this more nuanced, call it software-like control of a cell instead of hardware-based control where you're rewiring the DNA, it opens up a lot of other biologies that make it palatable for these much, much broader disease areas and indications. And that will make you have many reasons to have point-of-care cell therapy machines because now you're not just treating last line cancer, but you're treating an autoimmune disease as well, or you're treating a Parkinson patient as well.
And I'm wondering also, because right now it's a last line treatment, are we waiting too long with these life-saving therapies? Because if we try all kinds of other therapies first, the chances to finally cure that person, just diminishes with the time we're waiting, right?
It does. And that's where, kind of going back to me, cell therapies have to be the future. It's the level of sophistication these therapies can have is something that you would definitely want as your first line, both because it's more likely to work and because if you've done it right, it should have the least side effects and the highest efficacy. And that's why I go to that analogy of antibiotics and vaccines. It's kind of a no-brainer to take them if that's the problem you need to solve, because there's virtually no side effect to those things. And they're insanely effective at what they do. And I think a cell therapy is capable of that. The current cell therapies are kind of in the Stone Age relative to what they could be. But once you get that added layer of sophistication in them and you make them accessible through point of care, I would say there's many diseases that the first thing you do is do the cell therapy.
Yeah, and well, let's face it, cell therapy is still very early in the whole development. We're probably in the 80s of the antibodies or recombinant protein. Obviously, there's a lot going to happen in the future. So I'm curious, what is your vision about your technology and how this ties into the development of cell therapy? How would that look like in 5 years?
So I love that you mentioned the recombinant DNA stuff, because in a way, that's how we view this situation for cell therapy. Cell therapy is in its pre-recombinant DNA phase, where a lot of people think cell therapies are a great idea, but they are insanely impractical and expensive, just the way protein therapeutics were before recombinant DNA. And then once recombinant DNA was discovered and got implemented, suddenly you could make whatever antibody you wanted, you could do it at scale, and that gave birth to thousands of drugs. And that's where for cell therapy, I would say it's in a similar moment where if you can solve these fundamental problems of how do I engineer a cell in a quick and simple way where I can dial in whatever I want, back to that, like, how can I make whatever I want and do it in a scalable way? That's where we think Portal helps solve that problem, because I would say the problem is not a lack of ideas for what cell therapies can do. It's been just implementation is so insanely difficult and expensive. And so our goal is, can we be recombinant DNA to cell therapy in the sense that we are the critical module that's in many of these research scale systems or clinical scale systems that just enables that step of putting these 5 molecules into this particular cell type so now it can cure disease X. And if we can be that underpinning, that intel inside for cell therapy, I think that would be huge.
Absolutely, yes. It's going to be huge. Before we wrap up, I want to touch upon another aspect, because you're not only a scientist, you're also an entrepreneur, and you have to deal with a lot of investors and the whole finance part. And on this podcast, we don't talk that much about the finance and the business, but I think it's an important part of developing drugs and new therapies. So what would be your 2-minute advice to all the scientists who are entrepreneurs who want to start their own company?
I would say if you're more in the, let's call it technology and process space versus some biological thesis, it is certainly a challenge, because a lot of our industry, the difficulty is the time to adoptions are very long, or can be quite long, because our industry is slow, it's conservative, it's regulated, and that can be deadly from a startup thesis perspective, because a lot of R&D and money goes into making a GMP quality new tool, so to speak. And if your uptake is so slow, the VCs that are used to internet sensations that happen next day or within a year, it just doesn't fit their model. So I do think it's very challenging, and it's a matter of, can you convince the investors that you have a niche in mind of dedicated users that just really need your tech and they will pay top dollar for it. And this is a clear indicator that in the future there's 100 or 1,000x of the people you're already talking to, and that they will come in. And as long as you try to be as efficient as possible, get your product out the door, even if you don't think it's fully ready, but at least get the feedback from the users, show that you can get some kind of revenue from it. This is the kind of stuff the investors care about. But I'll admit, in our zone, investors, it's hard for them to get excited because of the timelines and costs involved. So you really need to be able to scrap it together better than most other sectors.
Yeah, I recently heard a talk about investments in the biotech space, and the huge problem is return on investment. It's so low and it's even crashing. It's compared to tech, Facebook, Google's and so on. It's just nothing. So it's a huge challenge.
And I could go on and on about those things, but I think it intersects with other big topics like how people think about drug pricing and the incentives, especially in the US, to do Me Too drugs versus novel drugs. If you had ways of ensuring novel drugs would get paid a reward that was worth it, but discourage Me Too drugs, I think these kinds of things will align incentives better. But yeah, no, biotech is tough because the returns are not what they are in tech.
No, definitely not. And what needs to happen so that in the future we'll have widespread adoption of these technologies, not only in the Western world, but also emerging markets?
For the cell therapy side?
Yes.
I think it's that simplification. I think that simplification is going to have to probably inevitably start with the Western world because they can afford the initial upfront costs of new tech getting implemented. And I think once it starts rolling there, the economies of scale will ensure that third world countries even can get it as well. And I think the key thing that's going to be the difference maker is I would say the West is overly conservative on certain quality metrics that drive the costs up like crazy. And some of those things you could relax. I think no exaggeration. If you relax the last 20% of it, you would probably drop 70% off the cost. And I don't think it's the kind of drop that imperils anyone. It's just we're conservative from a regulatory perspective because we can afford to be. So for some of these things, I think if you just lighten up a little bit on some of the quality and regulatory measures that are in place, it would make it very accessible in the third world. I mean, a lot of drugs, you could have injected it in the field. You didn't have to go in the hospital and get 3 nurses all over you to give you water and ask you how you're doing while they stick a needle in you. Like you could have done it in the backyard.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it would be such a game changer to have these life-saving therapies, not only for the top 1% in the world, but for people who are in even remote areas somewhere around the globe. That would be a tremendous game changer.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Iran, so I'm all for trying to get this as broadly disseminated as possible. I don't know if this will happen, but in a way, I wouldn't be surprised if some of this point of care cell therapy stuff actually starts in more ambitious developing countries first, because it does take 1 or 2 mindset leaps for it to happen. But for them, it's the difference of no access versus some access, whereas over here, it's the difference. And I could see it because already some of East Asia, I would say, is getting ahead of the US.
Yeah, I spent quite some time in Southeast Asia and Cambodia. Most of the time, I still do some projects there. And it's very personal because I have a friend who has a severe kidney disease. And I always think like that would be amazing to have a cell therapy to help him. That would be just a game changer. I mean, it would totally save his life.
Yeah, and I actually could see that happening. Just incentives would be in the right spot for the third. I mean, I know I'm mixing industries drastically, but just how like mobile banking kind of leapfrog things in parts of Africa, I could see you going straight to point of care cell therapy for a lot of the third world. The central manufacturing thing is just never going to work.
It will be way too expensive in a third world country. It's not feasible.
Yeah, and the kind of infrastructure it demands around it is insane. But shipping a dialysis-like machine isn't hard.
Yeah, definitely. The future is definitely bright. I look forward to all these developments. Thank you for making it happen with your technology. Before we wrap up, what is the most important takeaway from our discussion?
Point of care cell therapies are going to change the world. I will probably die thinking that even if it doesn't happen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Armon, for sharing all your insights, your passion to make it happen. Where can people connect with you?
So I'm at armon@portal.bio, or they can find me on LinkedIn, Armon Sharei. Always happy to chat. And we're very active with our partnering at Portal. So if we can ever be helpful to anyone, always happy to chat.
Awesome. So here is the open door. Please reach out to Armon, have conversation, explore partnerships. And thank you once again, Armon, for being on the show today.
Thanks so much, David. Appreciate you having me.
Hey, Smart Biotech Scientist. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and we'll see you in the next episode. And please take a moment to leave a review on the platform you found us on. It means the world to me. And if you're a CTO, are you struggling with complex bioprocess development challenges? I help C-level executives like you develop and manufacture breakthrough therapies with peace of mind. Let's explore how we can solve your challenges too. book a free strategy call at brühlmannconsulting.com. All right, smart scientists. That's all for today on the Smart Biotech Scientist Podcast. Thank you for tuning in and joining us on your journey to bioprocess mastery. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. By doing so, we can empower more scientists like you. For additional bioprocessing tips, visit us at smartbiotechscientist.com. Stay tuned for more inspiring biotech insights in our next episode. Until then, let's continue to smarten up biotech.